the third shift nurse who couldn't remember her own name anymore, not the one they called her now anyway. Brooke Sullivan had scrubbed in at Oak Creek Memorial in San Diego 3 years ago with a medical discharge, a limp that never fully healed, and a nursing license that was supposed to mean starting over. They didn't know she'd commanded a combat support hospital in Kandahar. They didn't know that the slight hitch in her left hip when she carried supply trays during night shifts came from shrapnel still lodged near her spine, pieces of an IED that had scattered across forward operating base Shank in 2019. What they saw was a competent civilian nurse who kept her head down, worked doubles without complaint, and never spoke about the scars on her forearms or why she sometimes flinched when gurneys dropped their metal legs with a decisive clang against the tile. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song above Ward 7 at 2,245 hours. Antiseptic burned in the cold air, that sharp chemical smell that never quite faded no matter how many years you spent breathing it in. Brooke moved through the ICU with calculated precision, her movements fluid as water finding the path of least resistance. She cleared rooms with her eyes before entering them, a habit so ingrained it felt like instinct. Check the monitor. Read the vitals. Note the equipment. Anticipate the next 3 minutes. Her hands moved with the economy of someone who'd learned efficiency under fire, where hesitation meant someone died. She adjusted for lines with steady fingers, fingers that remembered how to start central lines while explosions echoed outside the walls of a combat hospital, fingers that knew which medications you could push fast and which ones killed you if you didn't dilute them first. Under her scrub top, barely visible above the neckline, hung a single dog tag on a broken chain. The engraving was worn smooth from 3 years of pressing her fingers against it during quiet moments, muscle memory without meaning, habit without thought. She never thought about what it said. Never let herself think about the unit insignia or the blood type or the name stamped into the metal when the world was still burning. Dr. Raymond Caldwell watched from the nurse's station as Brooke moved through her rounds. He didn't see what she was trying to hide. What he saw was the limp, the careful way she favored her right leg, the way her left hip hitched almost imperceptibly every time she carried a supply tray or stood too long in one position. Military bearing, he thought. Or something like it. The way she held her shoulders straight despite the pain, that interested him more than it should have. Most of his staff shuffled through their shifts like exhausted children. Brooke moved like someone conducting a tactical inspection. He was 37 years old, Ivy League educated, and had been running Ward 7 for 8 months with the kind of control that came from knowing which palms to grease and which administrators looked the other way when inventory didn't quite match the dispensary logs. Caldwell had sources of power that made him feel untouchable, a brother-in-law who was a federal prosecutor, a network of physicians across 3 states who owed him favors, and a pharmaceutical sales rep with connections to people who paid very well for medications that vanished from hospital supplies and appeared instead in the veins of addicts across San Diego County. The money was good. The power was better. But the money was really good. He'd noticed Brooke Sullivan on her first night 3 years ago. Noticed her because she didn't fit the pattern of his other nurses. She was efficient without being ambitious. Competent without needing recognition. She worked the graveyard shift, 2100 to 0700, when the hospital was a skeleton crew and surveillance was thinner. She didn't ask questions. She didn't socialize. She had a limp and a secret, and Caldwell had learned long ago that people with secrets were either useful or dangerous, and the only way to know which was to watch them closely enough. At 2,300 hours, the ambulance doors burst open 2 floors below, and the machinery of emergency activated. Paramedics shouted status reports into handheld radios. The trauma elevator dinged its arrival. Gurney squeaked against polished tile as orderlies moved with practice speed. Within minutes, the new admission arrived on Ward 7, a man in his mid-50s with grey creeping through his hair, mute and unresponsive, eyes staring at nothing like a man who'd already died and hadn't been told yet. His medical alert bracelet read Colonel Marcus Vance, retired. A mute patient. Dead eyes. And around his neck, on a chain that had snapped at the clasp, hung a single dog tag identical to the one beneath Brooke Sullivan's scrubs. She was updating the medication dispensary when the patient rolled past on the gurney. The 4 line was already running, normal saline, slow drip. His chart came with him, a manila folder thick with preliminary assessments and blank spaces waiting to be filled. Brooke didn't look up at first. She was focused on the column of controlled substances, the locked cabinet where drugs disappeared and reappeared according to algorithms only Caldwell seemed to understand. Then she felt it. That vibration in the air, the kind of pressure change that comes before a storm. She turned slowly and saw him. Colonel Marcus Vance. The man who'd sat across a table from her 12 years ago at Camp Pendleton and recommended her court-martial. The man who destroyed her medical career with a single signature on a line labeled investigating officer. The man whose testimony had painted her as erratic, unpredictable, and unsuitable for command, never mind that she'd saved 18 Marines under his failed reconnaissance, never mind that she'd done his job and done it better. He'd needed a scapegoat for Operation Phalanx going sideways, and she'd been convenient. Now he was mute, unable to defend himself, unable to speak. Unable to do anything but lie in a hospital bed with dead eyes and a broken chain around his neck. Brooke's hand froze on the medication chart. Her breathing didn't change. Her heart rate didn't spike. She'd trained herself years ago to metabolize shock without displaying it, to process information while her face remained perfectly neutral. But her eyes moved. Slowly, deliberately, she walked toward his bed, and her gaze settled on his chart with the focus of someone reading tactical intelligence, not patient information. She traced the medication orders with one finger, scanning the prescribed sedatives, the dosages, the frequency. Her mind was calculating something, not medical protocol, but something deeper. Something that looked like tactics to anyone who knew how to read a person's hands the way a sniper reads wind. Caldwell was at the monitor bank when he noticed her hesitation. Noticed her move toward the new patient's chart. Noticed her study it with an intensity that made his instincts flare like warning lights. He watched her finger trace the medication line, watched her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, watched her breathing slow into something controlled and dangerous. Then she looked up. For exactly 2 seconds, her eyes met the patient's eyes. And Caldwell saw something there that made his blood pressure elevate: recognition. Calculation. History. He set down his coffee. The cup made a soft clink against the desk. That was all it took. That single moment told him everything he needed to know. Brooke Sullivan knew this patient. Knew him in a way that had nothing to do with hospital protocol or patient care. Knew him in a way that suggested she was either going to kill him in his sleep or prevent someone else from doing exactly that. And if she was either of those things, then she was a threat to every single operation running through Ward 7. Caldwell's eyes narrowed as he watched her return to her medication duties, her movements now minutely different, still efficient, still practiced, but now overlaid with the careful precision of someone aware she was being observed. He pulled out his phone and added a new note to his private file, the one that wasn't in any hospital system. He began documenting her access patterns, her time near the patient, her movements through the ward. He pulled up the security camera feed for Ward 7 and set it to record continuously. One nurse, no matter how competent, wasn't going to compromise everything he'd built. She would need to be managed. And Caldwell had learned from years of managing people that the ones with military backgrounds required special attention. They understood consequences in ways that civilians didn't. He watched Brooke finish her rounds at 03 for 5, watched her take her mandatory break in the staff lounge where she sat alone with black coffee and didn't speak to anyone, and made a decision. He would find out exactly who this nurse really was, what she knew about Colonel Vance, and whether she was going to be useful or dangerous. By dawn, he would have his answer. The overhead page crackled through Oak Creek Memorial at 0800, cutting through the morning shift change like a scalpel through silk. Brooke Bedpan Sullivan to administration. Brooke Bedpan Sullivan, your presence is requested. The entire nurses' station froze. Then erupted. 20 staff members turning in unison, eyes landing on her like searchlights, shoulders beginning to shake with barely contained laughter. Someone whispered it loud enough to carry, "Bedpan." Another nurse covered her mouth. A third actually laughed out loud. Brooke kept walking. Vital signs steady. Respirations normal. Her hands didn't shake as she moved through the corridor, past the orthopedic wing, past radiology, toward the administrative offices on the 3rd floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Her name badge caught the light with each step, Sullivan, RN, a name that until 48 hours ago had meant something in this hospital. Now it meant joke. Cautionary tale. The woman who'd stared too long at a patient's chart. Dr. Caldwell stood in the administrative doorway, arms crossed, his posture that particular blend of arrogance and calculated patience. The kind of stance men practiced in mirrors. His smile was surgical, precise, bloodless, designed to communicate that he already knew how this conversation would end. He watched her approach without moving, forcing her to walk the final 10 feet like a defendant approaching the bench. "Close the door," he said. She did. The latch caught with a soft click. "You're a problem, Major." He didn't use her rank in a respectful way. He used it like a scalpel, testing its edge against her composure. "And I don't tolerate problems in my hospital." She stood at parade rest without intending to, muscle memory from Kandahar, from briefing rooms, from the moment before everything changed. Her jaw was locked down tight as a surgical knot. "You're staring at that patient in 7B like you know him. Like you have history." Caldwell moved to his desk, settling into his chair with the confidence of a man who'd never heard the word no in a position of power. "You don't know him. You're a nurse with a mediocre record and a medical discharge we both know you barely earned. An injury claim that probably should have been denied. A file full of insubordination reports." He opened a folder on his desk. Her discharge papers. He'd pulled her military record. "You look familiar to the wrong people, Sullivan." "That concerns me." Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. But her mind was racing backward through time. Kandahar, 2019, the court-martial chamber, Vance's voice flat and authoritative as he read the charges: insubordination during combat operations, failure to follow extraction protocol, practicing medicine beyond her scope. 6 weeks of hearings. A career dissolved like sugar in water. Shrapnel still embedded in her hip bone, a constant ache that spiked when the pressure systems changed. "You're being transferred," Caldwell continued, his voice dropping into that register men used when they were about to destroy something. "County General. Overnight shift, psychiatric ward. Effective immediately." She opened her mouth. He raised one finger. "Sign the paperwork by Friday or I'll make sure your nursing license gets the same review your military career did. I've already made calls to the state board, to your previous hospitals, to people who remember your discharge." He leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. His presence was like a tank idling in a closed garage. "You'll be unemployable in California. Maybe in several states." One tear escaped her left eye. Just one. She didn't blink, didn't look away, didn't touch it. She let it track down her cheek like a slow-motion bullet, wipe it without breaking eye contact, her voice emerging from some deep place where composure and rage met and stood perfectly still. "My record speaks for itself," she said quietly, "even if you won't let it." He laughed. Not a real laugh. A sound like glass breaking in reverse. "Your record is whatever I say it is in this hospital. Sign the papers, Sullivan. Don't be stupid." She turned and walked out without being dismissed. That was the first mistake, her first visible crack in protocol. She should have saluted. Should have said yes, sir. Should have accepted her destruction with grace. Instead, she just left. That afternoon, at 1700, Caldwell waited for her in the parking lot. Not in his office. Not in a private space. In the parking lot, in front of the entire incoming evening shift, 12 nurses and orderlies loading equipment from a supply truck, their hands full, their eyes available to witness exactly what he wanted them to witness. "Sullivan," he called out. His voice carried like a parade ground command. A word. She was limping worse than usual, the shrapnel in her hip screaming with the afternoon heat, and she knew what was coming the moment she saw him. The setup. The public execution. He waited until he was certain everyone was watching. Then, effective immediately, you're relieved of charge nurse duties for performance issues. You're being transferred to overnight janitorial support rotations. Building C, third shift. Starting tonight. He turned to the orderlies, to the nurses with their boxes and their clipboards. Sullivan is no longer part of the nursing hierarchy. Treat her accordingly. Whispers started before he finished speaking. Someone actually snickered, a high-pitched sound that cut through the afternoon air like a blade finding bone. A charge nurse for 3 years, stripped in 40 seconds, demoted to the people who emptied bedpans and mopped floors. Not fired. Worse. Redefined. Brooke's jaw tightened, her teeth pressing together so hard she could taste copper. Her limp became more pronounced as she turned toward the hospital entrance, as if the humiliation itself had weight and gravity, pulling her down into the asphalt. She didn't look back. Didn't respond. Just walked past them all, her shoulders straight, her eyes forward, her dignity the only thing she had left, and she was determined to keep it locked down behind her ribs like classified information. But that wasn't the worst part. At 2100, she pulled Vance's chart during her final night shift on Ward 7 before the transfer took effect. The nurse's station was empty. Caldwell had pulled half the staff, reorganized shifts, made sure no one was watching when she accessed the medication logs. She sat in the break room with lukewarm coffee and a file that shouldn't have been accessible to someone at her new level, and her hand started shaking. Not from fear. From recognition. The sedative dosages were wrong. Not slightly wrong. Systematically, escalating wrong. Propofol for milligrams per kilogram baseline, then 6 milligrams, then 8 milligrams. Then 10 milligrams. The numbers climbing like a staircase designed to lead somewhere specific. She'd seen this pattern before, in Kandahar, in a field hospital where a morphine addict was trying to speed up a comatose patient's final hours. Pain was information. These numbers were shouting. She pulled Vance's intake summary, and there it was. Court-martial proceedings, Kandahar, 2019. Her name in the summary like a scar reopened. Colonel Marcus Vance, the man who'd sat across from her in that hearing room and read the charges with the precision of someone who'd practiced in the mirror. She'd disobeyed extraction orders because 12 Marines were bleeding out and the medevac was full. She'd made a choice. He'd made a career out of punishing her for it. Now he was here, silent and sedated, and someone was methodically overdosing him. She photographed 3 pages of the medication logs with her phone, hands moving with the precision of someone who'd been trained in intelligence gathering. The photographs were small, digital, deniable. 3 images. That's all she'd get. At 22:30, she found Caldwell in his office reviewing staffing schedules, his face lit by the pale glow of his computer screen. She knocked twice and entered without waiting for permission. Colonel Vance's sedative protocol is outside standard parameters, she said quietly. Professional. Measured. A nurse expressing a clinical concern, nothing more. He looked up slowly, his expression like a door locking behind his eyes. Are you questioning my medical judgment, Sullivan? I'm concerned about the patient. He stood. He walked to his door. He opened it with the kind of finality that made clear this was the end of the conversation. You're reassigned effective immediately. Ward 3, Pediatrics, overnight. You're not to enter Ward 7 again. His voice dropped, became almost conversational. That's an order. Or it's your job. Choose. She opened her mouth to argue. He raised one hand. Not a discussion. She left without another word, and as she walked down the corridor toward pediatrics, toward the night shift with children whose parents loved them enough to stay awake by their bedsides, she heard Caldwell's phone begin to ring behind her. Heard him answer with 3 different voices in succession, urgent, strategic, the voice of a man making calls that would protect whatever he was running in Ward 7. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. The break room at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like burnt coffee and the particular exhaustion of people who'd stopped sleeping normally 3 years ago. Brooke sat alone at 2,100 hours, Colonel Vance's chart open on the laminate table in front of her, her fingers tracing the medication orders with the focus of someone reading tactics instead of dosages. The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless frequency above her head. She didn't need to read the handwriting twice. She recognized the pattern immediately, the signature of someone who'd learned pharmacology from experience rather than textbooks, the kind of dosing protocol that killed people slowly enough to look like natural decline. The numbers told the story. Vance had arrived at Oak Creek with baseline sedation orders, midazolam 2 mg every 6 hours. Standard for a patient with altered mental status. But Caldwell's handwriting appeared on the chart at 14:30 that afternoon, his signature like a knife stroke across the page. Dosage increased to 4 mg. Then at 1800, another note. 6 mg. Then at 2200, just before shift change, an order for propofol infusion to begin at 0000 hours. Not written in the MAR, the Medication Administration record, where staff could challenge it. Handwritten on the progress note. Casual. Buried under clinical language about managing agitation and patient comfort. The kind of order that looked reasonable if you didn't understand that combining escalating benzodiazepines with an intravenous hypnotic agent would suppress respiratory drive until a patient simply stopped breathing on their own. Brooke's hip ached where the shrapnel had settled years ago, a phantom pain that always intensified when her mind was working through trauma protocols. She'd seen this pattern before. Not in San Diego. In Kandahar. In a field hospital where a surgeon who'd been awake for 47 hours had made similar decisions, except that doctor had been trying to manage unbearable pain. Caldwell wasn't managing pain. Caldwell was managing a liability. The chart continued. Vance's current vital signs showed what she expected, respiratory rate dropping from his baseline of 16 breaths per minute down to 12. Heart rate slowing. Oxygen saturation still holding at 97%, but the trend line was moving the wrong direction. She closed her eyes and saw the numbers as they would appear in 12 hours if nothing changed. O2 sat 92. Then 88. Then the point where alarms would start screaming and everyone would rush in looking panicked, when the truth was that someone had written it down in advance, signed their name, and walked away confident that by the time anyone noticed, it would be too late to trace back to intentional neglect. At 21:30, the nursing shift supervisor appeared in the break room doorway. Her name was Patterson, and she had the exhausted efficiency of someone who'd been managing 12 beds and 5 call lights simultaneously for 6 hours. She didn't meet Brooke's eyes. Sullivan, I need to reassign Ward 7. Davis is taking over Vance's care from here on. You're moving to pediatrics. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the kind of careful neutrality that meant someone had already called Patterson before the shift started and explained the situation in terms that made it clear this wasn't a discussion. Brooke nodded. She didn't ask why. She didn't argue. She closed the chart and stood, the movement smooth and controlled, muscle memory from 17 years of receiving orders without visible reaction. Understood, she said. Her voice came out level. When does the transition happen? Right now, Patterson said. Davis is already reviewing the care plan. Brooke walked past her without another word, and Patterson's relief was palpable. The supervisor had been dreading some kind of confrontation, some dramatic moment of defiance. Instead, she got what she expected from the quiet nurse in the corner, compliance. But compliance was a mask. Brooke had learned to wear masks so well that she sometimes forgot what was underneath. The pediatrics nurses' station was located at the opposite end of the hospital from Ward 7, 60 feet away through corridors that smelled like floor wax and the particular antiseptic residue that never quite washed out of hospital tile. She worked through the evening shift taking vitals on patients with ear infections and viral gastroenteritis, small bodies with simpler problems than what waited in Ward 7. The monitor system was networked across the entire floor. From her station, she could see Vance's vitals displayed on the third monitor of the secondary display panel, just another patient data stream among dozens, invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. At 21:45, she glanced at the monitor. Respiratory rate 14. Heart rate 62. BP 118/74. Still holding steady, but the sedation was working. The propofol infusion had begun at 0000 hours exactly as ordered. She watched the monitor the way some people watched their phone. The way soldiers watched perimeter cameras in forward operating bases. At 2300, she was helping a 3-year-old with pneumonia back into bed when she heard the intercom crackle. Charge nurse to pharmacy. Charge nurse to pharmacy. The overhead page was meaningless to anyone not listening for it. To Brooke, it meant someone had called asking questions about the medication orders. She tucked the blanket around the small patient and walked back to her station without hurrying. Respiratory rate 12. Heart rate 58. O2 sat 96. The trend was unmistakable. Caldwell had given Vance's assigned nurse clear instructions about monitoring comfort but not about recognizing the specific warning signs of iatrogenic overdose. Davis was competent. She'd completed her charting accurately, noted the vital signs, documented the patient's decreased responsiveness as appropriate sedation achieved. But Davis didn't know what Brooke knew. Davis hadn't been trained in field medicine. She wouldn't recognize that the line between therapeutic sedation and respiratory depression was being crossed in real time. At 0045, Brooke stood and walked toward Ward 7. Her hip ground with each step, that buried shrapnel reminding her that some damage never healed completely, it just became part of your baseline. She could feel the weight of the dog tag under her scrubs, hidden against her collarbone, the same unit insignia as Vance's tag, both from the same battalion, both survivors of Sanjin Valley. She'd worn that tag under her clothes every shift for 3 years, a private reminder of what Vance had taken from her and what she'd managed to rebuild anyway. Davis looked up as she approached the nurse's station outside Ward 7. The younger nurse's face showed the particular weariness of someone who'd drawn the night shift assignment. "You're not assigned here," Davis said, not unkindly. "Just stating a fact." "I know," Brooke replied. Her voice was quiet. She kept it that way. "But his vitals are crashing." Davis turned to look at the monitor. Brooke could see the moment it registered, the respiratory rate of 10, the heart rate of 54, the oxygen saturation that had finally tipped to 94 and was still trending down. "Oh God," Davis said. "I didn't," the orders said. "I thought this was normal." "It's not," Brooke said. "He's going into respiratory failure." That's when Dr. Caldwell appeared in the hallway. He materialized with the particular timing of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment, watching the shift change, calculating the probability that his replacement nurse might eventually notice something was wrong. His face was composed but his eyes were sharp as surgical steel. "Sullivan," he said. "Leave. Now. You have no authority here." His presence made the air pressure change, the way apex predators made prey instinctively aware that something predatory had entered the room. "He needs intervention," Brooke said. Still quiet. Still controlled. The mask hadn't cracked. "His respiratory drive is depressed. He needs oxygen support. He needs to be evaluated for—" "I have a physician managing this case," Caldwell interrupted. His voice carried that tone that doctors used when they were asserting dominance rather than advocating for treatment. "You are a nurse. With no authority. On this ward. Leave or you're terminated. Those are your 2 options." Davis looked between them, clearly uncertain, the weight of hospital hierarchy pressing down on her shoulders the way it pressed down on everyone who worked beneath the glass ceiling of medical authority. Brooke looked at Vance. Unconscious. His chest barely moving. The monitor showing what anyone trained in combat medicine would recognize immediately, a man being systematically suffocated by the person responsible for his care. She took one measured breath. The kind of breath that came from years of discipline, from learning to control her body's response to injustice the way soldiers learn to control their response to fear. Then one tear escaped. Just one. She didn't allow her voice to waver. She didn't let her hands shake. She wiped it without breaking her gaze from Caldwell's face. "When he wakes up," she said, each word landing like a hammer blow, he'll remember who actually saved him. She turned to leave, moving with the fluid precision that came from years of combat training, the kind of movement that was almost graceful in its lethality. Behind her, as she reached the doorway, Vance's monitor alarm began to scream. Not the soft warning tone of trending vitals. The screaming alert of a patient in acute crisis. Respiratory rate 8. Heart rate 40 and dropping. Oxygen saturation plummeting toward 85. Davis gasped. Caldwell's face went white. But Brooke was already in motion, walking away from the only evidence she needed, leaving behind only her words and the proof that he'd already written into the chart himself. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had 6 hours left on her shift, and nowhere to go except back to the pediatrics ward, where she would watch those monitors and know exactly what was happening in Ward 7, and know that anyone who tried to intervene would find themselves fired by morning. The alarm shrieked at 0203. Not the soft chime of a routine alert. The full code blue scream, 3 short bursts, then continuous. Ward 7 erupted. Vance's body convulsed on the bed, his back arching in silent agony, every muscle rigid, every nerve firing. The mute patient had no scream to give. His body spoke for him in violent thrashing that rattled the bed frame against the wall. Brooke heard it from the pediatric station 70 feet away. She was already moving. The monitor sang a death song as she ran, heart rate spiking past 180, oxygen saturation plummeting from 92 to 87 to 79, blood pressure a ghost of what it should be. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but something below was failing. Something critical. She knew this pattern. She'd seen it on a dusty forward operating base in Kandahar, on soldiers whose bodies were shutting down from the inside out because someone had given them too much sedative, pushed them past the threshold where a body could still recover. She didn't think. She sprinted. The nursing station dissolved behind her. She hit the double doors towards 7 at a run, muscle memory taking over before conscious thought could catch up. Davis, the resident Caldwell had assigned to replace her, was already in the room, frozen beside the bed with his hands raised like he was being robbed. The first-year resident, stammering, pale, useless, stood at the foot of the mattress, staring at the monitor as if staring hard enough could change the numbers. Brooke shoved past them both without slowing. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum beneath the alarm's shriek. Caldwell appeared in the doorway. Phone already pressed to his ear. Not calling for a crash cart. Not requesting additional staff. Recording. His jaw tightened as he watched her move toward the patient, but he didn't move. Couldn't move. If he stopped her here, in front of witnesses, it looked like medicine. If he called her out, it looked like murder. Vance's chest was heaving against the ventilator. His tracheotomy site, the one Caldwell had ordered 2 days ago when Vance first couldn't breathe, when the sedatives were already pooling in his lungs, was beginning to fail. Blood pooling in the airway. The plastic tube slipping as the tissue around it swelled from the overdose cascade. 30 seconds before complete airway occlusion. 60 seconds after that, brain death. Get me a 14-gauge needle. Now, Brooke said to the freezing resident, her voice like a tank idling in a garage, calm, mechanical, terrifying in its complete absence of panic. The resident didn't move. Brooke turned and grabbed the personal effects locker from the corner of the room. Her hands moved on their own. Combat medic precision. No hesitation. Every movement exact. The MRE packet was there, military-issued meal package in its thick plastic wrapper, tan and worn and somehow exactly what she needed. The same packet format she'd used in the field when commercial equipment wasn't available, when soldiers were dying and innovation was the only medical device you had left. She tore the wrapper open. The sound was sharp, plastic ripping like gunfire in the silent room. The trauma shears from her pocket came out already moving. She cut the wrapper into a 2x3-inch square, her muscle memory older than her nursing degree, older than her discharge, older than the 3 years she'd spent pretending to be someone who'd never learned to create life out of garbage and desperation on a fight's edge. The improvised seal went over the failing tracheotomy site with the precision of someone who'd done this before. Which she had. Just not in a hospital. Never in a hospital where it mattered whether she used her real hands or not. The plastic adhered to the skin around the tube. Held. Sealed. O2 saturation climbing. 79, 85. 91, stabilizing at 94. Vance's body stopped thrashing. His back settled. The seizure broke like a fever breaking. Heart rate dropping from the stratosphere. 168, 142. 118, still fast, still dangerous, but no longer a terminal velocity. The resident stared. Davis stared. Caldwell's expression hardened into something carved from stone, not surprise. Not shock. Rage. The cold rage of a man watching his plan fall apart, a man who'd pushed the sedatives too far and gotten caught by someone who shouldn't have known what to do. Brooke stepped back from the bed. Her chest rose and fell in measured breaths. Her hands were steady. She looked at the stammering resident with eyes that had seen worse than this pediatric ward would ever hold and said, "Get him stabilized. Now." It wasn't a request. It was a command. The resident moved. Caldwell was already gone from the doorway, phone still against his ear, already making calls. Brooke knew what those calls were. She'd heard them coming since the moment she'd stepped forward to save the man who destroyed her. The next 4 hours dissolved into the terrible clarity of waiting. She finished her shift in the pediatrics ward, moving through it like a ghost, knowing exactly what was happening in Ward 7, knowing exactly what Caldwell was doing with his phone, knowing with bone-deep certainty that this was the moment where her rebuilt life shattered. At 0620, she was paged to administration. Caldwell sat behind the desk with 2 security guards flanking him like props, like the kind of staging that only appeared when someone had already decided what the ending would be. He didn't look at her. Didn't acknowledge her rank or her name or the fact that she'd just saved a man's life 4 hours ago. He opened a folder and read from it as if she was a piece of equipment being decommissioned. "You're terminated effective immediately for practicing beyond scope, accessing a restricted patient against direct orders, and violating hospital protocol. Clear your locker by 0800. She didn't argue. She'd known the moment her hands moved that she was ending something. What she hadn't known was how quickly institutions would close ranks. How a man with power could make one phone call and erase a name from every hospital system in a county. By noon, the rejection emails arrived in clusters. 3 hospitals in 40 minutes. Then 4 more. Then 5. Each one citing credential review issues. Each one a confirmation that Caldwell's strategic calls had already blacklisted her before she'd even arrived at their human resources departments. She'd rebuilt her entire life after the medical discharge. The shrapnel still in her hip was a daily reminder that her body had already paid the price for service. The nightmares she didn't talk about, the ones where she was still in Kandahar, still in a convoy with soldiers who didn't make it home, still hearing the sound of the IED before she heard nothing at all, those were background noise now, barely louder than the rain. The nursing degree that was supposed to mean starting over, that was supposed to be the reset button on a career destroyed by a court-martial that had never made sense, that was supposed to let her live a quiet life in a city she'd chosen because it was 3,000 miles from anything that remembered her name, all of it, gone. One former comrade on a gurney. One moment of not walking away. One act of saving instead of surviving. And it had unraveled everything in 48 hours. The cardboard box was soaked when she finally left Oak Creek Memorial at 1600 the next day. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause for a performance nobody had wanted to watch. Inside the box, a chipped mug with a faded eagle, globe and anchor emblem, a succulent she'd kept alive for 2 years despite living in a city that wanted to kill everything green, and a photograph of her unit from before the IED took half of them. She sat at the bus stop across the street and didn't think about anything. Didn't cry. Didn't rage. Just held the box and let the rain soak through. The sound started low. Rotor wash, building from a whisper to a presence to a force that shook the streetlights. A Marine helicopter descended onto Oak Creek Memorial's rooftop, and the moment it touched down, Brooke felt something shift in the universe the way you feel pressure changes in your ears before a storm hits. Two Marines in dress blues walked straight through the ER entrance like they owned the floor beneath their feet. Staff froze. Receptionists looked up from keyboards. A nurse pushing a medication cart stopped moving. Orderlies stepped out of the Marine's path without being told. These weren't hospital security. These weren't consultants. These were men who moved through the world with the gravitational pull of institutional authority, the kind of presence that came from existing inside a system where people listened or faced consequences. They approached the charge nurse at the main desk. The senior Marine, a lieutenant colonel with shoulders like a continental shelf and eyes that had seen every version of human failure, asked one question: "We need Major Sullivan." "Where is she?" The charge nurse's face went pale. She pointed toward the front entrance without speaking. Outside, rain still falling, the lieutenant colonel approached the bus stop with a file in his hands. Brooke stood before he asked her to. Something in her body had recognized him, not as an individual, but as the incarnation of everything she'd tried to leave behind. He opened the file with trembling hands. Major Brooke Sullivan. The rain fell. The box in her hands was coming apart. "I am," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, military-trained, precise, untouched by 3 years of playing nurse in a hospital that had wanted to break her with nicknames and demotions. Inside the ICU, the Navy SEAL commander in dress uniform turned to face the gathered staff. His voice carried across the ward like a weapon, Bronze Star with valor for extracting 12 wounded Marines under fire in Kandahar province. 2 Purple Hearts for wounds sustained in combat operations, the same operation where Colonel Vance received incomplete intelligence about enemy positions. A physician's clipboard fell to the floor. The SEAL's voice continued, each word deliberate and final. Major Sullivan carried Colonel Vance himself to the medevac helicopter under active enemy fire. She sustained critical injuries from the same IED that wounded him. She was medically discharged with full honors. She is, and has always been, a Marine. Caldwell stood in the hallway, watching. His face was the color of old bone. An FBI agent in a dark suit moved past him with a folder. She didn't glance at Caldwell. Didn't acknowledge him at all. The credential investigation Dr. Caldwell initiated into Major Sullivan triggered a federal audit of Ward 7 medication dispensing. That audit revealed a 10-month black market medication scheme generating approximately $847,000 in unauthorized sales. Colonel Vance's overdose was Dr. Caldwell's mistake. Major Sullivan's intervention was the evidence we needed. Brooke's single dog tag caught the light. The one that matched Vance's, both from the same unit, both from the same firefight, both from a different life that had never actually ended, just been put on pause, waiting for the moment someone would remember who she was. She stood at attention while the room collapsed into chaos around her, watching Caldwell realize that power built on lies doesn't survive the truth. By noon, the calls had gone out. Caldwell had worked fast, faster than Brooke expected, but not faster than she'd trained for. Every hospital within a 30-mile radius of San Diego had received a message: credentialing hold, investigation pending, do not process employment applications. The terminology was vague. The intent was absolute. A nurse flagged for scope of practice violations was radioactive. Nobody hired radioactive. She sat at the bus stop 3 blocks from Oak Creek Memorial, rain hammering the cardboard box in her lap. The box held 43 months of her life compressed into artifacts. A chipped ceramic mug with a faded eagle, globe, and anchor, the symbol she'd earned at Paris Island when she was 22 years old and still believed in the linearity of rank. A dying succulent she'd somehow kept alive for 2 years on a hospital break room windowsill through sheer daily discipline, the way you kept yourself alive. One small act of care, repeated. And a photograph. For rows of Marines in desert digital camo, taken in Kandahar, 2019, outside the aid station before the IED took 7 of them. The photo was water-stained now. She didn't remember when her hand had started shaking enough to let it get wet. The rain soaked through the cardboard. She didn't move. A black SUV pulled into the hospital parking lot at 15:47. Then another. Then a Black Hawk helicopter descended onto Oak Creek Memorial's rooftop with the kind of precision that only came from pilots who'd trained in combat zones. The sound was a percussion instrument, a bass note that seemed to originate somewhere in the chest cavity. Brooke looked up. The rain was falling directly down now, not at an angle. The weather was changing. The weather always changed at the moment everything changed. 2 Marines in dress blues walked into the hospital 3 minutes later. They didn't stop at administration. They didn't check in at the front desk. Their uniforms, crisp, pressed, medals arranged in perfect rows, parted the air in front of them like a knife through silk. Patients stared. Staff froze. A lieutenant colonel and a major moving through the hospital with the kind of purpose that made everything else seem suddenly unimportant. They took the elevator to Ward 7. They walked directly into Colonel Vance's room. The intercom crackled. Major Sullivan to Ward 7. Major Brooke Sullivan. Code Blue to Ward 7. She was still at the bus stop. She didn't move toward the hospital. She didn't need to. The message had already been sent. She was a ghost. She'd been fired, blacklisted, erased. The voice on the intercom was calling someone who didn't exist anymore. Except she did. The lieutenant colonel opened Vance's file with trembling hands, not fear, she would understand later, but the trembling that came from holding something sacred. His voice was steady enough. Major Sullivan, the colonel regained speech an hour ago. His first words were your name. His second was wrongful court-martial. The words traveled through the hospital like electricity through wet ground. They reached the nurse's station. They reached pediatrics. They reached the break room where 3 nurses sat in stunned silence, suddenly understanding that the woman they'd called Bedpan Sullivan might have been something else entirely. The SEAL commander stepped forward. His voice carried like a voice trained to carry across a 100-meter range. Major Sullivan was awarded 2 Purple Hearts for service-related injuries. Bronze Star with Valor for extracting 12 wounded Marines under fire in Kandahar. The same operation Colonel Vance had incomplete intelligence about. The same operation that led to his errors in judgment regarding her removal from the unit. Bronze Star. The words hung like a medal on the air itself. 2 Purple Hearts meant twice bleeding. Meant twice the shrapnel. The Marines in the hallway stood at attention without being ordered to. The audience was listening now, really listening. The laughter was gone. It had been gone since the helicopter landed, but now it was officially extinct. The FBI agent stepped up. Mid-50s, the kind of face that had seen too many crime scenes to be surprised by anything. But she was methodical, precise. The investigation Dr. Caldwell initiated into Major Sullivan's credentials revealed instead a 10-month scheme. 17 patients administered excessive sedatives beyond clinical protocol. Medications diverted from inventory. Falsified records. A trafficking ring moving black market opioids through the hospital pharmacy. Colonel Vance's overdose was not a medical error. It was Dr. Caldwell covering his tracks by eliminating the one person on staff with the medical and tactical training to see the pattern. The one person who could see it because she'd been trained to see it. Because her hands had muscle memory for saving lives under fire. Because you didn't forget that training just because you wore scrubs now. Major Sullivan's intervention at 0203 this morning saved the colonel's life and preserved evidence against Caldwell that wouldn't have existed otherwise. The FBI agent paused. The records show you were terminated for accessing restricted patients. What the records don't show is that Dr. Caldwell was the one accessing them, with forged authorization signatures under your name. Security moved through the corridor toward Caldwell's office. They found him at his desk, already packing. His face had gone the color of ash. His hands, when they tried to cuff him, were shaking, actual shaking, the kind that came from losing everything in a single moment and understanding that there was no way to lose it. He'd built his entire authority on a foundation of lies, and when the truth arrived, it didn't come gently. It came in federal credentials and handcuffs and the completely silent stares of every person he'd ever managed. Brooke walked into Ward 7 at 16:04. Colonel Vance was conscious. His eyes tracked toward the door. The tracheotomy site was healing, the tube removed. When he saw her, something shifted in his face, not relief, something deeper. Recognition. The kind of recognition that meant he finally understood what he'd destroyed and what had saved him. "Sullivan," he said. The word came raspy, damaged by the tube, but clear. "Major Sullivan." She stepped to his bedside. She didn't salute. She didn't break composure. She was exactly what she'd been in Kandahar, a Marine taking care of her people, which is what Vance had always been, regardless of what paperwork had said otherwise. Vance gripped her hand. His grip was weak, a man who'd been sedated for 2 days, whose body was rebuilding itself moment by moment. But his eyes were entirely present. Entirely aware. "The court-martial," he said. "I didn't know. The intelligence was corrupted. I was working with incomplete information about the extraction team's positioning, and I made decisions based on. I was wrong. I was wrong about you. I court-martialed a hero because I didn't have the full picture." She squeezed his hand once. "Not forgiving. Not yet. But present. The way you stayed present for people who were struggling to understand what they'd done. You're awake, Colonel. That's the only thing that matters now." Her voice had changed. It was lower now, steadier. The voice of a major, not a nurse. The voice of someone who'd made a choice about who she was and was no longer pretending otherwise. She wore her dog tag openly, the mate to the one on Vance's broken chain, both from the same unit, both from a firefight that had taken 7 Marines and given her the muscle memory to save 1 colonel, however much that colonel had hurt her before. The rain continued outside. The cardboard box at the bus stop was dissolving slowly, but the succulent would survive. Some things do. The mug would live forever. The photograph would be framed and hung on a wall somewhere that honored what she'd given and what she'd been asked to sacrifice. Subscribe for more stories of hidden strength in quiet places. Like this video if you believe the quietest person in the room might be the most dangerous. And comment, would you have done what Brooke did, saved someone who destroyed your career? Or would you have walked away?